sort of foundation. So I'm not going to dive anything too deep. We're not going to go discussing, lots of different external libraries and packages. It's mainly to essentially to lay the groundwork for more complicated things. So that the final goals by the time we finish is to have a full working app where we'll have a back end, we'll have a front end, we'll do something interesting, and I'm also open to suggestions as to what the final app will be, but we'll kind of go from there. So to start off with, who am I? So my name is Yonatan. You're welcome to email me about Node stuff anytime you want, feel free, and I'll answer when if I can get back to you. You will notice in every single slide there's this little sort of like widget 1, 2, 3, and that will be related to the live coding thing we'll attempt later. So that's the groundwork for that. Just an example, I'm not an expert in anything, which is very important to know. I'm not a Node.js expert, although I've been doing it for a long time, but I think to call it an expert is wrong because there's so much stuff out there. There's so many different libraries, there's so many different things that it's basically, all I've been basically doing is essentially just Googling stuff the last few years and picking things up as I go along. And of course I've made a lot of mistakes along the way in terms of how I structured things, but essentially hopefully I'll try and smooth the process a little bit so you'll fall a little bit less in the beginning. So the question is, why are you here if you're not an expert? But you're here because we're going to try and go learn a few things. So one is to strengthen the Jerusalem coding community, to meet other people who are interested in similar types of programming things, to ultimately become a Node.js developer, because that's what we, it's growing, the market's growing, a lot of people are interested in it, to build a RESTful API. How do you build a proper API? What needs to be thought about? What if to go into it? We'll make a full stack app at the end, and we'll try to have a bit of fun. The goals now is just to get comfortable, and we'll see a little bit of code and tinker with it a little bit. So what is Node.js? So first you Google it. There's a lot of interesting things that you'll read, a lot of articles, and we're actually in a very interesting time in the Node.js community. So if anyone's been following over the last, say, 6 months to a year, there was something called a fork in the main Node branch. So everything is obviously, who here uses Git? GitHub? Excellent. About a year ago, 2 years ago, I did the same thing, and no one knew what Git was. I was very disappointed. So basically, there was a fork, and IOJS was born. And essentially, one of the main differences was the version of the V8 engine. So the question is, what is this V8 engine everyone speaks about? This is not like one of these typical lectures where I'm going to spend details going into all these funny buzzwords, as I already end another buzzword. But basically, when Google wanted to make Chrome, they wanted to have a way to understand JavaScript and interpret it very, very quickly. So they created essentially a JavaScript interpreter, which was fast, was memory efficient, and they also had an event library. Both of them were open source. So come along some smart people with some interesting ideas, and they said, hey, you know what? We can just run this on the server, and that's how Node.js was born. So IOJS has now been merged back into Node.js. That was the separate fork, which used the much newer version of the V8 and had a few other interesting little features involved. The other important thing is ES6. So everyone who's familiar with JavaScript knows everyone talks about ES6 all the time, and that's because it is a pretty big deal. So what does that also mean? So one of the big differences also is how it was handled, how it's integrated in Node.js. Now most of what we're going to do tonight, we're not going to focus on ES6 and deep delve into all the things. What I want to rather look at is what the most common things are right now in the market, and we'll get to that also a little bit later. So any questions about what Node.js is? Anybody feels they don't know?
Is it still split, or did it
It rejoined, and if you were noticing, I got an email from a client of mine who was in a panic because he was using 0.12.28 or something, and then all of a sudden he did an install and it said 0.4 point something, and he was like, what's going on with my dependencies? And that's basically because they merged back in and they carried on from the version number which IOJS is running at. And also a pretty big thing, because it means there wasn't a big split. So why is it so popular? That's also one of the big kind of questions. So there's a few reasons, but it's all JavaScript. So anybody who knows a little bit of JavaScript can actually dive in almost immediately and can write Node.js stuff. A very small memory footprint. Basically, it doesn't take up use a lot of memory. It's not. It's a little bit more liberal in its memory usage. It's fast, relatively speaking. It's not the fastest by any means, but it's faster than PHP, and for most people that's good enough. It has minimal dependencies on the server, relatively speaking. Meaning that you can take a vanilla Ubuntu server, a CentOS server, kind of, I don't know Windows at all. So anything, any Linux server, and probably works same with Windows, and you can, it can run pretty quickly, pretty simply. There's a very, very big Node.js community. The community is growing. It's been growing for years, and that you can see in NPM. So NPM, I'll just discuss very, very briefly what that is, and then we'll move on, because that could be a whole other massive topic, and we won't get into now. So any language needs to have modules, needs to be extendable. So what NPM does, it essentially is a tool which allows people to store their code, store functionality, either online, offline, wherever it is, and integrate into your program. So you can require something. For example, later on we will require Express. We'll include Express into our program. NPM stores it for us. So we can do an NPM install, and it will essentially bring a dependency for us. And also some nice things about NPM is that it understands dependencies in a slightly different way to what you typically might have. Now I don't have a board, so I draw an imaginary picture. So most dependencies will work as you'll have all your dependencies in a file, and you'll say you have to have all of these, and everyone checks this dependency. But what if you have one module and another module, and each one then has a slightly different dependency? How do you do that? So essentially they have a tree where every single dependency has its own dependencies. Now the downside is that you get this massive dependency tree. So when you first create your Node app, we'll look at it later, you'll see this thing called node_modules. So all modules from NPM are stored there. Alright, so what's in the box? So what do you get when you just take Node.js and you just start looking at it, which is very, very important. And why? Because sometimes you don't need to bring in a whole big library in order to achieve a very simple goal. Sometimes you might want to have a really, really simple app. You want to have it really small. You might want to have hundreds of them. You might have many of them running, or whatever it may be. You want to keep it nice and small, nice and simple. You don't have to maintain things. So why worry about maintaining too much stuff? So the big, I wouldn't say mistake, but the big thing that's left out for most people when they start with Node is they don't actually look at the Node API. So what I want to do is just we'll jump away from the slides now. We'll look at the Node API. I'll point out one or two things which are, it's very, very interesting, and we'll move on from there. If I can work out how to do that. Okay, so it's Node.js org API. There's a link in the slide, and we should probably move this out the way. Alright, so what we see here is a whole bunch of things. Firstly, there's buffer. What is a buffer? A string buffer is going to convert something from base to base 64. Use a buffer. You can have add-ons. So what most people don't know is that Node.js isn't fixed. You can create your own extension of the language in C or C++. And it's actually not that complicated. It's definitely out of the scope of what we do now, but it's something that's just nice to look at. You can run child process, you can spawn process, there's something called cluster. So let's say, for example, what is Node.js? This is an important point. So Node.js is what's called, it's a single thread. So you might, if you use Java or any other type of language, you have threads. So we might have many of them, but Node.js is one, meaning if you have 4 CPUs and you have one application, it's essentially using one of your CPUs. So there's a few ways to utilize your full CPU capacity. One way is to just have lots of the apps running. Each one will take a different thread. The other way is to use essentially cluster. So cluster is a way which Node allows you to create essentially sub-processes, one assigned to each and every CPU. So if you have 4 CPUs, you have 4 processes, and it automatically works as a sort of its own load balancer. There's debate in the community if it's stable or not. It's now considered more stable than it was a year or two ago. Crypto, you can do cryptography, SHA-1, whatever you want to do. If you want to do single sign-on plugins for Heroku and various other things, you can do it. You can make your own hashes and keys and do MD5 out the box. Debugger, you can actually debug Node. Some people think you can't. You can. It's possible. DNS. can do different lookups, and you can get IP addresses. Domain is not the domain that you're thinking of. Domain is something which allows you to catch errors. So it's got error handling, it's got file systems, you can handle events, you've got HTTP, HTTPS, you've got the operating system information about the process. There's a whole world inside Node.js that you get for free without having to install anything external, and that's pretty useful. So it's worthwhile having a look at this before you start anything, just to see what's out there and what you get for free. All right, ES6. So we will talk about it a little bit because everyone talks about it, and so I sort of have to. So ES6 is the latest version of JavaScript. It's still not out there in the world as mainstream, but there's a lot that actually is part of the stable version of Node.js that you might not know about. So we're going to just click on this link, I guess. That's why I put it there. And right, so basically what we see is we have a whole bunch of things in it. Classes, you got the let, and a whole bunch of things already inside Node. So you have a lot of the ES6 things out the box which you can get, which is considered stable. There's also an option. How do I go back? There's also an option to use something called stage. So stage is stuff that's not really ready for the real world, but it kind of is. But no one will say it is, because if they say it is and something goes wrong, they'll be held responsible. And in progress, you shouldn't use. So you can still do a whole bunch of, and you can use all of the ES6 features today without having to do anything special. All right, so NPM, again, we discussed it before. It's a package manager. There's something called a CLI. It's a command line interface. And it means you can do npm install something, and you'll get it. We'll show that later. And one of my it's my personal opinion, I think that's one of the main reasons why Node.js was so successful, was because it's easy to download dependencies. It's easy to download and bring other people's code into your code and to use it. And you can find almost anything. There's a project that started a little while ago called nodesecurity.io, which tried to do auditing of every single Node.js package, and it was decided that's impossible. There's just so much stuff coming out all the time, you can't audit everything. And one thing that's important, choose your models wisely. Sometimes you look at something and it's like, wow, that does exactly what I want. But pay attention, because maybe there's a million bugs open to it. Maybe it was only uploaded yesterday, no one maintains it. Maybe there's, see how many people use it, how many don't. Look at the statistics. And finally read the manual. I gave a talk about it about 2 years ago, and read the manual. Which was basically all things that went wrong because you didn't read the manual. Simple things that said, about whether it's about the Mongo database, which you don't really think about until you actually read it. And then you land up with production failing, and then everyone says, well, what's going on? And you kind of discover, and you say, well, I didn't read the manual, and you look silly. All right, so this thing called the read, eval, print loop, which is, yeah.
I have a question about the previous slide. Why do you have package manager per framework? I mean, I come from Python and Ruby, and you have package manager per language.
Well, it's like this. It's per language and per framework. So NPM is the language, the accepted go-to places. This is the place where you get your dependencies from Node.js. You don't have to use it. No one says you have to use it. In fact, it's actually run independently from Node. Just so happens the guy who created it, which is Isaacs, he's very involved in Node.js, but it's a kind of his pet project that he started many years ago that sort of snowballed and became this massive contribution to the community. Now he's making some money off it also. But you don't have to use it. No one has to use it. It's just really useful, and it's recommended because you kind of you're on your own. So it's trying to fight. You've got your whole army of modules waiting for you to use instead of kind of fighting the battle on your own.
You can use NPM for any JS library.
For anything you want, and it's used by even non-standard things. Alright, so now we've got the read, eval, print loop. So basically what it really is, I don't want to get into too much now because we got time. Why not? I'm going faster than I expected. So I'll show you what this is. So I have something here, and I can just do node. and I'm in the node console. It's very useful. I can now test out all different node things. I can type the word process, and I can see my entire process, everything that's there. I can do any test command I want. If I'm curious about something in JavaScript, I can just try it out. Just like a lot of people who here messes around in the console of Chrome to test their JavaScript. Almost everyone does it, right? So it's the same thing, except it's node.js. So Chrome you can't really rely on that for your node stuff because it's a little bit different. You have some dependencies which, you have some features that you don't have in Chrome. So it's kind of really, really useful. You can require things. You have settings required automatically. You can use the file system. You can do all sorts of fun stuff. And the reason why it's good to test and try and experiment is because JavaScript doesn't always work the way you expect it. There's a famous video called the WAT video. Who's seen the WAT video? Yeah. Who hasn't seen the WAT video? Should I put the WAT video on? Anyone object you've seen it? I'll put it on for them?
It's short.
It's 4 minutes. I'll put it on 4 minutes. I actually have just in case because I think it's pretty funny. I just need to find it. Right, so this is the first part of the video is about Ruby, but essentially this is a guy, he's a programmer, and he discusses some of the interesting things about JavaScript and the behavior that you haven't really seen before. I hope this will be loud enough for you to hear. I suppose if I unmute my computer, it will help, right? Right.
Undefined variable, of course, it name errors, as you would expect. And if you try to assign B to A,
it's about Ruby, so just ignore this.
Undefined, of course, it name errors, as you would expect. And what happens if you try to assign A to A with A undefined? Correct. Nil. WAT. Let's talk about Ruby. Ruby, unlike some other dynamic languages, does not have bare words. So
JavaScript will come in a second,
don't worry. Have strings come out. Unless you define a particular method missing that does the right thing. And then if you type bare words, suddenly Ruby supports bare words. And in fact, it will even support bare words with bangs in them. And this is not deserving of WAP. This is actually a result of how awesome Ruby is. But if you ever actually do this, then WAT. Let's talk about JavaScript. Does anyone know in JavaScript what array plus array is? Well, let me ask you this first. What should array plus array be? Empty array, I would also accept type error. That is not what array plus array is. Wrong. Wrong. Array plus array is empty string. Obviously, I think it's obvious to everyone. Now, what would array plus object be? This should obviously be type error because those are completely disparate types. Does anyone know what this is? No. Close. No. Far away. It's object. Right. Nicely done. Now, of course, because this is plus, so you can flip the operands and the same thing comes out. So if we do what? No, that's just an object. If you do object plus array, you get exactly the same thing, which, as you can see, do. And finally, the only one of these that's actually true is because you add arrays to an empty string, that doesn't make sense. But an object plus an object is actually not a number. So this one's actually right. And exactly, right? Like, what is even going on in this lab? I don't even understand. What person with a brain in their head would think that any of this is a good idea? Okay. Enough making fun of languages that suck. Let's talk about JavaScript. If I say array.new 16, or just array 16, I get an array of 16 things, which it represents as 16 commas, which is obvious. And if I then join those with a string, then I get the string 16 times. This is actually the only line in this entire presentation that's reasonable. Now, if I take that string and then add a 1 to it, it interprets the 1 as, or casts the 1 to a string, and then we get WAP1 a bunch of times, fine. Does anyone know what will happen if I subtract one? I'm assuming no one does. I'll give you a hint. Does this help? Does anyone know?
So the point is, what you expect is not always what you get. So you should try first. And don't put in your code and just kind of scratch your head afterwards and wonder what on earth is going on. Right, so that is your, wherever I put it, somewhere on my computer, on one of my desktops, is that console. So we'll kind of skip, we'll move on from there. Right, so debugging also, it's very useful, and you can actually add it to your program. You can create a program and add a node console, sort of like interface with your program if you want to. Right, okay, so now we're on to something which is more interesting. We're also kind of like we're warming up to understand a little bit about node.js, but now this is a technical thing. So you want to build an API. How do you build your API? What are you going to do? Because ultimately, you know, everything is useless unless you can build something useful. So you get two types of APIs that people normally build. I'm not an expert in this area, but I know the basics. So essentially, it has something called RPC, which is there's a link to Wikipedia which tells you all about the technical details, which I don't know about.
Remote procedure call.
Exactly, that's it. Remote procedure call. Thank you. And basically, what you're doing is you're specifying an endpoint. You're telling it, okay, I'm going to be getting all the users, and you're saying a function with its name, or I'm going to be making a post to add users. So the first thing to understand is that who knows what the HTTP verbs are? Exactly. So just in case, okay, if you don't know, look it up because it's very important. But essentially, you hear people saying, first you have get, which gets something. You get post, which creates something. You get put, which updates something. You get delete, which deletes things. There's a whole bunch. There's many of them, many more than I mentioned now. And why is it useful? Because everyone says, let's make a CRUD. You know, so what's a CRUD? It's a create, read, update, delete. So if you want to create something, you want to make a post. You want to read something, you do a get. You want to update something, you do a put. You want to delete something, you do a delete. So you kind of, that's all you really need to do. So if you just know what to call it, you sort of your program writes itself in a certain way. Why? Because when you want to get something, it's a get. So that comes to REST, and like understanding what really REST is. So essentially REST is supposed to, in theory, explain resources. So what's a resource? A user is a resource. An animal could be a resource. Content could be a resource. And that's pretty much it. So what do? You say, okay, we've got this resource user, and this is a get. So what does get do? It brings stuff in. So it's going to pull in all the users. So it's pretty obvious. Why? Because we say, okay, it's a get, and we want users. We want this, give me this resource. So you just, when you look at this, you know what it does. No one has to explain to you what this function does. I can post to users. So no one has to tell me what it does. Why? Because I'm going to post is for create, so this creates a user. Great. I'm doing get, and I'm specifying a particular ID. No one has to explain to me, I know that this gives me a particular user. And the same if I delete, and the same if I do any other type of update that I want. When you use sort of like a REST style, everyone understands your code, and also other programs understand your code. Now I wrote REST flavored for a reason, and that's kind of like a term I call my stuff REST flavored because no one really ever writes a proper RESTful API. And there's a whole paper on what it is to write a RESTful API. What do you need to do? It's long, and there's like all sorts of different types of like different resources you need. So most people kind of go with that sort of like the REST flavor, but don't take it until the very end. And in most cases, that's fine, it's good enough. I've never actually had to really implement from like A to Z the full RESTful protocol. And there's like there's a RESTful, and there's like another version of RESTful which I can't pronounce, which is HAOTAOS or something like that, which is like another level.
Benefits of using actually REST. So why do we do that?
Because it's convenient, and it's easy to understand, easy to create. So I'll show you now when you get to the Express stuff, a little bit later. But basically what we're doing, this is, let's say for example, okay, add user happens to be a very simple example with add user, but what if I had something slightly different? I have to actually like make this meaningful. But I can call this anything, I can call it a chihuahua, and I can say, get chihuahua /ID, and I know I'm going to get a chihuahua. I don't have to know what a chihuahua is, but I'm going to get one of them. So it's sort of it's a very useful thing. It's not, you don't have to do REST. You definitely don't. You can do everything with RPC. And maybe you want to mix up a little bit. That's also fine. But you'll notice most of the frameworks we're going to look at now assume by default everybody wants to work with a RESTful API. So what to choose? So here's the big question. You have Express, which is everyone knows what everyone in the Node community knows what Express is. Express was one of the first frameworks to really help the Node community. They had lots of middleware, lots of dependencies. It's really, really good. There was a really, really strong team of maintainers, and there's still a strong team of maintainers, but some of those maintainers broke away and created something called Koa, however you say it. You can say it however you want. So Express and Koa are actually very similar. Why? Because the same guys wrote it, basically. The guys who wrote Express wrote Koa. And when you look at the documentation of Koa, you notice that it looks really similar. So going from Express to Koa is something which is pretty easy. You have Happy, or HAPI, or I don't know, however you say it. And that's basically the odd man out in this combination. It works a little bit differently. I don't have too much experience with it. It's a little bit lighter, a little bit faster performance-wise as far as I understand in Express, and it has a lot of security benefits. And one of the reasons for that is one of the leading security experts in the Node community right now contributes to HAPI. So he's constantly pushing security things. But the question is what to choose. So choice is still, so basically all three are great. There's no winner. You can't say Express is better than Koa, or Koa is better than Express. Although the truth is, if it continues the way it's going, in the future, Koa will be better than Express simply because Express has a few weaknesses, particularly in its call stack. So before we continue, let's take a pause and discuss how does Node.js actually work, right? So you got this now it's your imaginary whiteboard over here. So my finger is basically the loop, essentially the event loop that you're having. And what it does is it does this and does this and does this and does this and does this. And now you get over here you've got a task which is takes time. Something that takes time. So normally you process like Python would wait. Something would normally wait. But what Node does, starts doing this, but actually the thread continues going down, continues. And that's just how Node.js works. Now Express works using middleware, and there's something called ticks, and we're going to discuss that next time. But Express is basically uses a array, essentially, to store one thing after the other. This route doesn't match to this one, this one. So its efficiency is a little bit less than some of the other ones. But I still say you should use Express. Why? There's so many resources out there that use Express. Most of the frameworks, if you look at the mean stack, who here knows what the mean stack is? Okay, the mean stack uses Express, right? There's both mean.io, both mean.js use Express. There's huge amounts of documentation. Their documentation is actually very good. They still have really good maintainers. There's a massive community. And when you're starting out, I'll say go with the flow. Don't go against the grain and start using Koa and then be sitting there on Stack Overflow asking questions, getting no answers. All the answers are ready. You have all the answers to Express ready. You have thousands, tens of thousands of modules that work with Express. You have thousands of blog posts that explain about Express. You have thousands of code snippets that explain about Express. So go with Express. And when you're really comfortable with Express, then move to something else like Koa or HAPI. But definitely don't start with them because it's just not worth the effort and the overhead in trying to understand and trying to learn how these things work. Okay, that's not for now. Oh, it is for now. We're moving fast. Alright, so now we're going to we're going to look at some code. We're going to start looking at Node.js, an actual app. Because part of what we're going to do is actually maybe write some code. So I said before to whoever was there earlier that we're going to attempt to do something that I don't always do, and that is to write some live code and see what we can achieve. And also, I'm kind of going much faster than I expected, so we have a little more time, which is great. All right, so before we do that, we want to look at object-oriented JavaScript. Now, this code here is it's not the best code in the world, because I did this morning in a rush, but it should give you a good example of what it means to create an object or create a class in JavaScript. And the reason why it's important is to understand a few things about Node. The first thing to understand is, who knows what exports is in Node? Everyone knows exports. Okay, so you have exports and you have module.exports. Who knows the difference? Export is module.exports, an alias. So when you have you can have, we'll get that later. So let's have a look at this. So basically what we're doing is we're having class variables. So JavaScript out of the box isn't really an object-oriented language. You kind of fake it until you sort of get to ES6 and then it kind of is more real. And we'll look at that in a minute. So you have this class variable, and what is this thing? This is actually accessible to everyone in the class. You can just to everyone in the class. Now inside your class, which is just a function, you're just returning stuff. Just in general, Node, it's not, well, I like to return stuff near the top, and that way you can look at stuff straight away, and you can kind of anticipate everything else that's below. So you just look at this top part of your code, and you can kind of say, I know what this thing does. Right, so you have globals. So what is globals? Globals just is really simple. It takes two parameters, a key and a value, and it says to itself, if there's no value, just return the key. Meaning that what's it's trying to do, it's just trying to like do a getter and a setter at once. Saying, all right, and you see a lot of stuff like this. It's not pretty, but you see it everywhere. And that's so, with Node, you just have to accept the fact that it's not always great. There's not everyone writes good code, including myself. I'm terrible. My code is really not great code. But kind of, I get by, and I've written enough stuff that I kind of like don't make the major mistakes over and over again, but I'm not one of these perfectionist coders who does things in the most efficient way possible, but it kind of works. So globals, key value, if there's no value, return this class variables of the key. So basically you say, here's an object, give me the value of that. Right, and because of the return, it's not going to go further on. Now obviously if I get here, there's both key and a value, so I'm doing a set. So I'm saying, okay, I'm setting it. Wonderful. So if you pass one thing, it's a set, pass one thing, it's a get, two, it's a set. Right, not beautiful, and I had to explain that, which is, the fact that I had to explain it already means that it's a problem. So as soon as you have to start explaining code, it means it could be done better. So whoever wants to send me a better way of doing it, I'm happy, and I'll use it in my next one. Print options is really a simple thing, it just does print pretty, key and value. So this is just an example of, I'm using a function. Why? Because I'm doing the same thing twice. Every time you do something more than once, it should be a function. There's no reason to write the same code twice ever. So it's a really simple example. So what am I doing? I'm doing a console.log. Console comes built in with Node, which is basically a process.standard.out.write. And that's all it does, with a /n on the end. So I'm just doing I'm writing something, I'm pushing something out to my standard out. And it's a key, and I'm doing a plus, and I'm doing that, and I'm doing a JSON.stringify, and everyone knows what it is. The nice little thing which is interesting is that you have, in the stringify, you can specify how many levels to print it out, so you can kind of print out nicely. So instead of getting this ugly thing, you can actually print out a nice JavaScript object, and maybe we can look at that.
What's the number of spaces?
Yeah, you're right. Sorry, the number of the space in it. Yeah. But it's nice, you can print something out. So what you're doing is you're console logging something that's like kind of easy to read. Now this is also, there's much better ways to do that, and there's libraries that do all of this for you, and I'm not recommending doing it this way in your real code, but I was one really simple example with no dependencies that you can get the idea of. And what we're doing at the end, we're doing module.exports equals class. So that's the most important line. This is the line that you should sort of burn into the back of your head. So if I require a file, how do I make functions accessible to people outside of a file? And that's what exports does. When I export anything, I say anybody who's requiring me has access to this thing. So the fact that I did module.export equals class, I'm saying anybody who requires me, meaning that file, has access to class and all of it. So that's essentially what module.export does. If I left it out, it would be kind of useless to me. It wouldn't really help me much at all. So let's look at what we're doing here on this little thing, and we'll maybe run this afterwards. We're saying, okay, samples require sample 1, and we're saying instance 1, essentially a naming convention just to make it easy to see the differences now. So this is sample 1, instance 1, and we're just saying sample instance 1, just JSON object in there, sample 2, instance 2. And we're doing a globals pizza tasty, right? So what are we doing? We're just adding a global variable pizza and its value is tasty. Now when I go and I print out my options for number 1, you'll get pizza tasty, you'll get the global options as part of it. When I print out number 2, you'll get the thing that it's set when it created itself. Because also if you look here, this is, before I mentioned, this is almost like, you can think of this as a constructor. Basically, this invisible line there is your constructor. So I'm passing it the options that be part of that instance. And eventually when I print it out, we'll see that the class variable is shared, and the options is particular and local to that instance. So I'll just run it, and if I can find it. So what have we got? We ran it, and we're outputting options of sample 1, instance 1, class variables pizza tasty for the first one. We'll notice for the second one, it's sample 1, instance 2. So we can see that its local variables are preserved in between each one, and finally we're seeing that, but its class variables are shared. So the class variables are shared between everyone, and the local variables are local, and finally we even did another require again afterwards. We go back to the code. That. If we go back here to the code, you'll see I did another require, and this is just to prove the point that it's actually shared. So what is this? Like, where can you see this in practice? If you Mongoose, which we're going to get to soon, is an ODM. It's a way of connecting to MongoDB. It's basically your driver. It's not a real driver, but it does more things. It has validations. It has pre-post save options. It has many things. Now you'll notice that you can do when you do var mongoose require mongoose, and you're going to get your mongoose object, and you're going to connect. When you connect to it, you're creating a connection. That connection is preserved between all of its instances. So if you later on go var mongoose require mongoose, you'll get the same connection and all the same models that you already had, which is kind of useful. All right, so now we're going to build something. So we'll start building, and we'll use Express as our framework, as we discussed, and we're using Mongoose as our ODM, and we're using MongoDB as our database, and we're going to kind of figure our way through it, and as we're going along, I'll be pointing out different things in the code. Then you want to stand and stretch, drink Coke, pretzels, pass them around. All right, we'll continue. The goal now to understand callbacks, because callbacks can be tricky to understand if you've never used Node.js before. So we're going to look into it, understand what it is. What is next? You'll see soon what next is. app.use, app.get. This is kind of doesn't mean anything to anybody who hasn't seen Node.js before, but if you go over this again and you look at this, it will make more sense. All right, let's begin. Now, maybe I should use a table. Definitely going to regret this later. Alright, so we're going to start off and we're going to show what a callback is. So a callback is something very simple. So why do we have callbacks? Who knows why we need callbacks in Node.js? Go for it.
Because scope isn't passed around.
It's not passed around?
No.
So what is, so meaning that if I make a request to an HTTP request, it takes time. Exactly. So it's for asynchronous things. Anything that doesn't happen one night, that goes off and does something, you need a callback. Also to pass scope, you're right, that inside JavaScript, I do take a function, and I do var a equals 1 inside the function, and I go outside, it's out of my scope, I can't access it. So there's a few ways to get around it. So the typical way is callbacks. We're not going to look at promises now, because most people who know Angular know how to use promises anyway, and it's built into Node. You can sort of look it up on your own. And that is ugly code, just ignore that and we'll improve it together later. So let's make a new file, and we're going to just start writing code and work it out. So this is going to be blah.js. Right, so the first thing is we're going to make a function. And like every function, every demo, we call it foo. But because I like pizza, we'll call it pizza instead. So we have function pizza, and pizza does something. It takes time for pizza to cook. So let's say, for example, we will call it cooking time. Right, so this is how long the pizza will take to cook. And we're going to say, all right, so it's going to basically have a set timeout. It's going to do something when it finishes. And this is going to be cooking time. Right, so that's how long it's going to take. And when it finishes, we are going to return done. Okay, so we're returning done. So what is this going to do? Returns done. Okay, so now if I come here and I say, we'll make another, and I say, all right, pizza. What?
It's supposed to work next. Are you showing that it's not working, or?
That will work. Won't work. It won't work. But it's part of the. You'll see. It's part of the. I'm making saying won't work on purpose. So we'll do pizza 1000 in theory, and what we'll do is we'll go to. And we'll do node blah. Does nothing, right? We expected that. We'll jump back here. Well, because I didn't do anything. It did nothing. Now what we do? What's it going to do now? Wait a second and print done. Wonderful. Okay, not too exciting, right? So let's go back. We'll undo that. And I actually really want to return done. I want done. I want to get the value. I've now gone off. I'm making an HTTP request. I'm going to get something from some API. I have all the results back, and I want to pass it on. So what am I going to do? So what if I do var result equals pizza 1000, and I do console.log results. Anybody who doesn't know Node.js, what's going to print out? We'll find out. So it's going to print out undefined.
Can you do it again? Undefined comment very quickly.
It's fine. It doesn't wait because it's fine. I'll explain it all. So what are we doing? In theory, you'd expected, if you don't know Node, you expected to print out done. And clearly, undefined is not done. So why not? And let's just make this more interesting. Let's put a console log over here. And we'll console log done. It's really done. Okay, now we're going to do it again. Undefined, done is really done. Okay, so what do we see? We see that it printed the console log it printed the undefined before it did the console log. So what's happening here? That the thread, this is now a good point to demonstrate with my imaginary, that essentially what's happening is that we're inside here, the thread is, the event loop is, or the loop basically, the pointer, whatever you want to call it, I forgot what it's actually called, just kind of goes here and starts doing this and just continues. So what does it do? It just continues and says return whatever, or it doesn't even return done. You see, it doesn't even return done. Because why? Because it's just finishing. And it's finishing, and when it finishes, it returns something which is undefined. So this return is actually returning to no one. No one's waiting for this return at all because it already got a return before that was undefined immediately. So what are we going to do? How do we handle a case like this where we want to get a result after time? So we use the easy way, we can use a callback. So what do? We say callback. And I apologize if anybody knows this stuff already, but we need to go through this to sort of, I'm going to call back, done. So now when I do this, what's going to happen? It's going to be an error because it doesn't know what callback is, right? Undefined error, right? So you see how the error also took its time, so it only waited to the end. So what I need to do, I need to tell it what callback is. Well, callback is a function. So I have two options when I do this. I'll show you both. I can do something like this, function result. And I can now do console log result. Now this is irrelevant to me now. So what am I doing? I'm cooking my pizza and I'm getting the result and it's finished to my callback. Now when I do this, it says done, it's already done, done. So it actually worked. That's the result we expected, we wanted. But what do we have to do to do it? We had to use a callback. This function is defined over here and is called when we finish, called callback. Now, just a styling note, that's ugly, right? If you do it like this all the time, it's really hard to read. What happens if you add many of those? So instead, we can make a function, and we can call the function call the waiter. Right. So what we do is we can do call the waiter. So now when you do this, it calls the waiter, and the waiter knows it's done. All right. So that's one of the most important things. Believe it or not, even though it's really, really silly, and it's the most important thing you see in Node, because nothing will work without that. Meaning you'll never be able to get anything right if you don't understand the Node works with callbacks. And I remember my first time using Node was about 5 years ago. There wasn't much documentation, and it was my first day at a new job. And the CTO said, here's an API, we need to add this and this function and fix a few things up. And I sat there and I got undefined the whole day. I just couldn't work it out. So eventually I found a kind blog post somewhere, and then it saved the day for me. But it was it was something which I made a big mistake on. Now that we know we use callbacks, we can actually look at some code. So a real Node.js program, which is not just a play program.
So if this is all single threaded, does this mean that there's a run loop going that basically sets an alert at some point that when the run loop hits that clock cycle, it then instantiates your code and runs that piece?
Pretty much. Well, basically, everything works essentially on events, internally and internally. You see there's a lot. You see the ons use on this, on that. There's a lot of events used everywhere. It is single threaded. It does go and calls different events when different things finish. The exact nitty-gritty how everything works deep down, I can't tell you. But that's pretty much how it is. And that's one of the reasons why Node is relatively speaking fast, because you don't necessarily keep now reading a file. It's kind of continue doing a whole bunch of other stuff, and the file finishes and says, hey, the file is done. So you're not being held up by this, which is why people always say it's non-blocking. It's like the famous thing everybody says, and I tried to avoid saying it as long as I could, and now we got to it. But it's sort of non-blocking, not really, but it behaves in that way. And that's sort of let's move on a little bit here. Now, we're going to have a look at the Express app. So I showed you the command earlier. We'll just run it now just for fun again. I can do Express, and I can say ASD, and I can tell it various other parameters I want. So now we'll just do that, and we'll just scaffold you an Express app, which is kind of convenient. And it tells you what to do. It says cd ASD and npm install, and then you can run it. And and within the 2 seconds you have an Express app running, and it's pretty useful. And we're not going to look at this one. We're going to look at one I've already been sort of butchering quickly now before we started. And I'll show you a few things here. The first thing is package.json. Almost every Node app has a package JSON, and there's some really basic things that you'll see. And package JSON essentially is related to NPM. It's what defines NPM's dependencies and tells it various other things. There's you can do scripts to, when you start it, when you install it, there's dozens of things you can do with it, and I recommend everybody doing npm --help or looking on the manual to see what to do. So basically dependencies, it needs to use Express. It uses version 4.1.3, and this is something called Semver, S-E-M-V-E-R, and Semver is basically a way of defining and explicitly explaining what dependencies you want to use. It's worth looking into because you can have greater than this version, equal this version, there's all different things. So basically we're using Express version 4.1.3. And we're also using Jade, although we're not going to use Jade, it just was one of the dependencies that came along. Morgan is some other thing for doing like debugging, and there's a whole bunch of things you don't need, and we're using Mongoose. And the script is a startup script, which if you do npm start will run that command. So if you do npm install, you can write an install script and we'll do something, or npm uninstall, etc., etc., and you have name and version. Right, that's your package JSON, you have to understand what it is. Right, so once you've got this, and once we do npm install, it gives us all those dependencies, and there you'll see something called node modules I spoke about earlier. So in node modules, you'll see body parser, cookie parser.
What IDE are you using? What's the...
This is a Sublime 3, I think. I used Vim for a very long time, which is just a no editor, so I'm the wrong person to ask about.
So you don't want from command?
I work a lot from command line, but this is not one of the fanciest IDEs that you'll use. It's very lightweight, and it's kind of got some nice plugins. It's good to start. It's a nice starting IDE. And right, so that's Sublime. It's kind of useful. Right, so now if you notice in node modules, we've got all these dependencies that we specified, and if you look inside body parser, you'll notice it's got a node modules, like I mentioned before. It's got nested dependencies. And if you click inside node modules, you'll have a whole bunch of other stuff. If you click inside one of these, it has luckily nothing else. But sometimes you would have another node modules, and then you have more stuff. And sometimes it can go on, not forever, because it checks that you won't have a circular dependency, but just to understand that the dependencies work in an interesting way, and there's a nice command you can do called npm ls, which lists all your dependency tree. Right, we're not going to go too much to npm now. Next up, let's look at our app. Okay. Right, so
יש שני מודולים שמשתמשים באותו dependencies. נעלה אותם פעמיים?
It's tricky. About a year ago, we were working on creating like a cloud. You basically deploy apps to the cloud, and we're using the same dependency all the time. It's using up so much disk space. So we kind of like try to create like a dependency maps, but it can be very tricky to get it right. And I'm not sure if we ever got it right. I can't remember. It's probably because everyone can define their own ones. Meaning that it's the public can create. So we don't always have all the dependencies on board. So to get the whole dynamic growing dependency tree was a bit of a headache. I'm not a system guy, but from the system guys, they complained about it. Right. So what we do is we see it starts by running this. Now, this is not the best example as your first app to look at because it does a lot of stuff. So what I might do is something a little bit simpler. So we're going to dummy down the Express app and make something really, really simple. So I'm going to go to the same app, I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it blog.js. Oh, that's, Lisa did that for me. So I have now blog.js also inside this app. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var express is require of express. Okay, great. What have I done? I've now got a dependency based on what's in my node modules. And I can say var app equals express. Wonderful. And I can now do app.get, this is the simplest example, of that will be something. Now what do we notice we have here? A callback, exactly. So we have a callback, And I'm just going to do is a res.send. Hello. And we're going to do is a app.listen of a port which I'm not using. And that's a good question. Time? זהו.
עוד 5 דקות.
5 דקות? אוקיי, טוב, אז... I'm not allowed. 55. Okay, so we're ready now. I thought I had more time, but anyways, let's kind of speed along then because I didn't get to what I want to get to.
To bargain with.
We'll bargain. So let's, okay, we'll meet up parts, one, app. Alright, and we're going to just do node.js. So nothing happened, right? But also you notice the app didn't end. So it's not a complete failure because something's there. So if I go to my browser and I go to port localhost 3055, it says hello. Wonderful, you just created a server that says hello. So that's kind of interesting. And why is it interesting? Because I didn't have to do much to get a result. And that's kind of like always pleasing to people, to not do much and get a result. But what we do notice is that it used to get. What happens if I did something like this? app.route and API/users, right? And it's going to send back something. Just because we're running out of time, I'm going to send back something, and I'm going to say, make an array of objects. Right, so now if I come back here, and instead of this, I do /API/users, I have an error.
You have to rerun it?
Oh, sorry, I made a mistake. Mistake. So what I have to do here is I made a route. I didn't say what I want to do. I didn't say it's a get, didn't say it's a post. So I'd say this is actually a get. And for this get, I want you to do this function. Right? So now we'll run this again. And now, what do you know? Get.
You need a terminal slash.
No, you don't need terminal slash.
You don't have to restart the server?
That's correct. I did not restart the server. Thank you. So we're going to run this again, this time using nodemon. So nodemon is basically something that watches for changes. So we're going to run this again, blah. And it's giving an error. Why to say ports in use? So what I do, I do an else of okay, or we just change the port. 3056. Run it again, and now it's running. So we're going to go back to our browser, wherever it disappeared to. I think I killed Chrome actually. That was a mistake. But anyway, Chrome was running it. So 3056. And we've got YouTube going. And there we go, we got our users. Okay, so it's a get. By default, the browser makes a get users. Now, because we're under time pressure, we're going to make a little change. And let's say, hypothetically speaking, this is called users, right? That's a function, right? And I'm just call this function get user. Now it's a little bit rough and ready. And now we just calling that same function. What happens now if I want to create a user? I'll just do a post. And when I do post, I'm going to do is create user. Great. Create user doesn't exist. Let's make one. Function create user and res next. A callback. All right. So now what I'm going to do is just do res.send create. Right. So how do I test this? You have to use something like Postman or something to make a request to create a user. So if I now come to Chrome and I make a request to 3056/API/users and I want to make a post.
User, not user.
Users, thank you. And we send. It says create. Okay, great. So we said the post gave me create. So a different HTTP verb to the same endpoint knows what to do. Now that's the beauty of REST. So a REST means that you define the right verb, you get the right result, and it's intuitive. Now because we really are running out of time, we'll try to do something in the last 2 minutes, which is very important about Node. It's next. So that's one of the second most important things you'll see. What is next, right? So I'm going to make this function called function login, yeah, or whatever, login, thank you, good example. And it's going to get res next. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, now we have no body parser here. So with your permission, if I have 2 more minutes, I really want to show you this because it can make life a lot easier. I'm just going to copy some code because that's what good programmers do. Copy code. Where is it now? Okay, here we go. So we can use body parser and we're going to make this smaller to make my life easier. And we're going to do this. We're going to use this body parser. So we're using middleware. So I've now created my app. And before anything, app.use happens on any request, any verb, it will always happen. And I'm going to be parsing JSON. So now what I want to do is I actually want to use something from the body that I get. So let's say now I'm going to make a post for logging in. And I'm going to say like this. If rec.body.name זהו, טוב. Alright.
עכשיו לפני השאלות יש את המארח שלנו.
Didn't get to the part I wanted to. I thought we had a little bit more time. So what I'll do, Blineder, is I'll send a small app with some detailed comments about what I wanted to explain. And essentially, the goal was actually in the lecture slides was that we have somewhere, wherever they disappear to, you'll notice, and when you look at the slides again, I'll make it actually so it works, you'll notice that there was a little iframe at the bottom that loads every now and then. And so the goal of this actually was going to be to create a small app that allows us to send questions to the server. And what it will do is we'll basically write them to Mongo using Mongoose. And that will essentially create a stream and it will be pushed straight into the slide. So as the lecture is going on, people can, for example, like push out questions and they'll pop up on the screen. So that's something which we didn't get to doing, and it's kind of it's a pity, but I'll send you the code, you can have a look and play around with it.
So what's next?
So what is next? So next on one leg, that's a good question, is the next function. So if I had to, for example, it's a callback, but it's a callback of what? The callback of the next function. So let's say if I had to now go, now they're closing here in I think 15 minutes, the whole building, so we have to, so basically if I had to come here and I had to do a get, and I could say login user. So what's it going to do? It's going to first do login. If login calls the function next, it will proceed. If it doesn't, it will stop. So I can do, if I do login and I pass it something, an error, it knows that an error happened. It will never continue. So the way that you structure your program is you say, I always make sure that I validate, verify everything before I get to my function. So if I now run and I use my login here, get user knows that this guy has logged in. He doesn't have to, he straight away he knows this guy's logged in, doesn't have to check anything. It's do a whole bunch of other interesting things, you can add stuff to it. And the same way, if I had, for example, we had this app.use. Express works in the way where it does this first. It always does the body parser. And you take the post body, it creates a JSON object. It then does your routing. Once the routing's finished, it will then either return a result, like it does here, doing a res.send, because a res.send is a res.write and a res.end. So it ends your request. If none of this match, it will continue. And it would hang forever, or give, in this case, hang forever. But if I put an app.use at the end, it could catch everything and send back a 404. Or if I do an app.use and I pass in 4 parameters instead of 3, it assumes the first parameter is an error. So in Node.js, a lot of the time you see people make the first parameter as an error. It's something you assume will happen. So that's what next is. Next says continue, or it says don't continue. And that's kind of on one leg. Any other questions? Fine. All right, so I guess we're going to pack up, yeah?